Eugene Bondurant Sledge was born November 4, 1923, in Mobile, Alabama. He grew up in comfortable middle-class circumstances. His father was a prominent physician, Dr. Edward Sledge. The family lived in a two-story house on Government Street. Eugene, called Gene or Sledgehammer by friends, was a slight young man, weighing around 135 pounds, standing 5 feet 8 inches. He had a genteel southern upbringing. Church on Sundays, hunting trips with his father, summers on the Gulf Coast. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Sledge was 18 years old and enrolled at Marion Military Institute in Alabama. Like millions of young Americans, he wanted to enlist immediately. His parents, particularly his physician father who had served in World War I, urged him to finish college first. Sledge reluctantly agreed and enrolled at Georgia Tech in 1942. But by late 1942, with the war intensifying and friends shipping out, Sledge could wait no longer. In December 1942, he left Georgia Tech and enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps Officer Training Program, V-12. However, he soon realized he didn't want to wait through the lengthy officer training. He wanted to fight. In early 1943, Sledge withdrew from the officer program and enlisted as a regular Marine private. His parents were devastated. Dr. Sledge, who had seen the horror of the Western Front in World War I, knew what his son was volunteering for. But Eugene Sledge, like so many young men of his generation, felt the pull of duty and the fear of being left behind while others fought. Sledge reported to Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego in April 1943 for boot camp. The experience was brutal. Drill instructors screaming, physical exhaustion, constant discipline designed to break down individuals and rebuild them as Marines. Sledge survived it, was assigned to infantry training, and then specialized training as a 60mm mortarman. By late 1943, Sledge was assigned to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division, K/3/5 in Marine Corps nomenclature. The 1st Marine Division was legendary. They had fought at Guadalcanal in 1942 to 1943, the first American ground offensive of the Pacific War. Now they were in Australia, recovering and training for the next operation. Sledge joined K/3/5 in early 1944. He was 20 years old, had never been in combat, and was joining a unit of veterans who had survived Guadalcanal. The gap between his inexperience and their hardened combat knowledge was immediately apparent. But the veterans, men like Corporal R.V. Bergen, Sergeant Snafu Shelton, and Private First Class Bill Layden, took Sledge under their wing, teaching him what they'd learned about survival. In the spring of 1944, K/3/5 received word. They were going back into combat. The target was Peleliu, a small island in the Palau chain. Intelligence estimates predicted the island would be secured in 3 days. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Part 1. Peleliu, September 15th, 1944. September 15th, 1944. 0832 hours. Peleliu Island, Palau Islands. Eugene Sledge crouched in an Amtrak, amphibious tractor, with 40 other Marines as the vehicle churned through the water toward Orange Beach. Around him, the air was filled with noise. Explosions from naval gunfire hitting the island, the roar of aircraft overhead, the metallic clatter of equipment, and the nervous silence of men about to experience combat for the first time. Sledge had been awake since 0400, checking and rechecking his equipment. As a mortarman, he carried a 60mm mortar baseplate weighing approximately 40 pounds, ammunition, his rifle, grenades, water, rations, and personal gear. Total weight, over 80 pounds in the oppressive Pacific heat. The Amtrak's ramp dropped. Sledge ran forward onto Peleliu's beach. The first thing that hit him was the heat. Peleliu in September was a furnace. Temperatures regularly exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The volcanic sand radiated heat. The air shimmered. Within minutes, Marines were drenched in sweat. The second thing was the noise. Japanese artillery and mortars opened fire on the landing beaches. Explosions erupted along the shoreline. Machine gun fire from concealed positions swept across the sand. Marines fell. Some were hit before they even left the Amtraks. Others made it a few yards inland before being cut down. Sledge ran toward the cover of a coral ridge, following his squad leader. A shell exploded nearby, showering him with coral fragments and sand. He dove behind a coral outcropping, his heart hammering, his hands shaking. This was nothing like training. Training had been orderly, controlled, safe. This was chaos. Men were screaming. Wounded Marines lay on the beach calling for corpsmen. Japanese fire came from positions that seemed invisible. The enemy was dug into coral caves and reinforced bunkers that naval bombardment had barely touched. Sledge's squad moved inland, trying to secure their initial objective. The terrain was nightmarish. Peleliu was coral, razor-sharp coral that shredded uniforms and skin, that provided perfect defensive positions for Japanese forces, that turned the island into a natural fortress. By the end of D-Day, the 1st Marine Division had landed approximately 17,000 men on Peleliu. Casualties for the first day: 200 dead, over 900 wounded. The predicted 3-day operation had barely begun. What Sledge didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that Peleliu would become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had prepared a defense in depth. Rather than defending the beaches, where American naval gunfire and air power were overwhelming, he had fortified the interior of the island, particularly a coral ridge formation called the Umubrugol, which the Marines would call Bloody Nose Ridge. Nakagawa's plan was simple: make the Americans pay for every yard in blood. Days 2 to 5, the meat grinder. The days blurred together. Sledge's first week on Peleliu was a continuous nightmare of heat, thirst, fear, and violence. The heat was unlike anything the Marines had experienced. During the day, temperatures in the coral ridges exceeded 120 degrees. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Water was severely rationed. 1 canteen per day was standard, sometimes less. The water was hot, tasted of chemicals from purification, and was never enough. Dehydration was constant. Men's lips cracked and bled. Urine turned dark brown. The Japanese defense was methodical. They had created a network of caves throughout the coral ridges. These weren't simple holes. They were reinforced positions with multiple entrances, connected by tunnels, stocked with ammunition and supplies. Japanese soldiers would fire on advancing Marines, then disappear into the cave system before counterattack could be organized. Sledge learned quickly. The veterans taught him: stay low, move fast between covered positions, watch for snipers, don't bunch up. When mortars come in, get flat and pray. Trust your squad mates. Your life depends on them and theirs depends on you. K/3/5 was tasked with attacking Japanese positions on the southern end of Peleliu. Each day meant advancing a few hundred yards, fighting for each coral outcropping, each cave, each defensive position. The casualties mounted steadily. Sledge witnessed his first death on D+2, 2 days after landing. A Marine near him was hit by a Japanese sniper. One moment the Marine was talking, the next he was dead, shot through the head. The body fell and lay there in the coral. There was no time for careful evacuation. The body was dragged to a collection point and the squad kept moving. This pattern repeated constantly. Men Sledge had trained with, had eaten with, had shared jokes with. They were there one moment, gone the next. Shot, blown apart by mortars, killed by snipers. Each death registered but couldn't be processed. There was no time for grief. The mission continued. The smell of death permeated everything. Bodies lay in the coral, exposed to tropical heat. The stench was overwhelming, sweet, rotten, unforgettable. Decades later, Sledge would write that he could still smell Peleliu. The nature of the fighting. The combat at Peleliu was intimate and brutal. This wasn't war at a distance. This was close-range killing, often face-to-face. Sledge's mortar squad would set up their 60mm mortar behind cover, receive coordinates from forward observers, and fire high-explosive rounds at Japanese positions. The 60mm mortar was effective against troops in the open, but less effective against fortified caves. Often, Marines had to assault caves directly. The procedure for clearing a cave became routine. First, call for supporting fire, mortars, artillery, tanks if available. Second, approach under covering fire from riflemen. Third, throw grenades into the cave entrance. Fourth, wait for detonation. Fifth, assault the entrance. Sometimes Japanese soldiers would throw the grenades back out before they detonated. Sometimes wounded Japanese soldiers would wait inside with grenades, pulling the pin when Marines entered, killing themselves and anyone nearby. Sledge participated in multiple cave assaults. The terror of approaching a cave entrance, not knowing if the occupants were dead, wounded, or waiting in ambush, never diminished. Every cave could be a death trap. Flamethrowers became crucial weapons. Flame tank crews and infantry flamethrower operators would approach caves and fire streams of burning fuel inside. The flames consumed oxygen, killed by asphyxiation as much as by burning, and psychologically devastated defenders. But flamethrower operators were priority targets. Japanese soldiers would focus fire on them, knowing the flamethrower's fuel tank would explode spectacularly if hit. Sledge watched flamethrower operators work and marveled at their courage. They carried death on their backs and walked toward enemy positions knowing they were being targeted. The psychological descent. By the second week on Peleliu, Sledge noticed changes in himself and others. The constant exposure to death, the heat, the exhaustion, the fear, it accumulated. Men stopped talking as much. Faces became expressionless. The 1,000-yard stare appeared. Veterans looking at something distant, not seeing what was in front of them. Sleep was impossible. When Marines weren't attacking, they were defending against Japanese night infiltration attacks. Japanese soldiers would probe Marine lines at night, sometimes attacking in small groups, sometimes individually. Sentries had to stay alert. Falling asleep on watch could mean death for everyone. The lack of sleep created a fog. Men operated on automatic. Digging foxholes, cleaning weapons, eating rations, firing mortars, it all became mechanical. Sledge also noticed the brutalization. Marines began taking Japanese gold teeth from corpses, prying them out with knives or KABARS. Some men collected ears or other body parts as trophies. Officers tried to stop this behavior, but largely failed. The dehumanization was complete. Japanese soldiers weren't fellow human beings, they were Japs, nips, enemies to be killed without mercy or remorse. Sledge himself felt the transformation. His disgust at seeing Marines mutilate bodies faded, his horror at killing diminished. He began to feel nothing when firing his mortar at Japanese positions, knowing each round might kill or maim. The college kid from Mobile, who loved bird hunting and classical literature, was being eroded away, replaced by something harder, colder, more capable of surviving. Bloody Nose Ridge. The worst fighting on Peleliu centered on the Umabrogal, Bloody Nose Ridge. This coral formation dominated the island's interior. It was a maze of ridges, valleys, and caves. The Japanese had fortified it extensively. Taking it required frontal assaults up steep coral slopes under fire from positions above. K/3/5 was committed to the Bloody Nose Ridge, fighting in late September. The tactics were simple. Advance up the coral slopes, suppress enemy fire, take the position. The execution was catastrophic. Marines would advance, taking fire from multiple directions. Japanese positions were interconnected. Suppressing one position meant fire came from another. Artillery and air support helped, but couldn't eliminate the defenders. The Marines had to take each position individually, often with grenades and bayonets. The casualty rate was staggering. Companies that started with 200 men were reduced to 50 or 60 in days. Platoons were down to squad strength. Squads were down to fire teams. The replacements that arrived, fresh-faced Marines straight from training, were killed or wounded within hours or days. Sledge witnessed this cycle repeatedly. A replacement would join the squad, be introduced around, receive some quick advice from veterans, then be sent into combat. Often the replacement was dead before Sledge learned his name. The veterans stopped learning names. It hurt less that way. One incident Sledge recorded: a replacement Marine, barely 19, asked Sledge how to stay alive. Sledge, now a combat veteran despite being only 20 himself, replied honestly, "Keep your head down, do what you're told, and pray." The replacement nodded seriously. He was killed the next day by a mortar round. The reality of wounds. Sledge saw every type of combat wound: gunshot wounds, small entry holes, massive exit wounds, shrapnel wounds, irregular tears through flesh, burns from flamethrowers or exploding fuel, traumatic amputations from direct artillery hits. The Navy corpsmen attached to Marine units worked miracles. Under fire, corpsmen would run to wounded Marines, administer morphine for pain, apply bandages to stop bleeding, and organize evacuation. Many corpsmen were killed or wounded while treating casualties. Sledge developed enormous respect for corpsmen. He watched them work on horrific wounds: abdominal injuries where intestines were exposed, chest wounds where lungs were visible, head wounds where brain matter leaked out. The corpsmen never hesitated, never showed fear, never abandoned wounded Marines. Some wounds were treatable. A Marine shot through the arm or leg, if bone wasn't shattered and major vessels weren't hit, might survive with proper treatment. These Marines were evacuated to hospital ships offshore, received surgery, and eventually recovered. Other wounds were fatal: massive trauma to vital organs, severe blood loss, head injuries. These Marines died despite corpsmen's efforts. Sledge watched men die on stretchers waiting for evacuation, die in foxholes surrounded by squad mates, die alone in coral crevices where they'd crawled after being wounded. The randomness haunted him. A mortar round would land, killing one Marine instantly while the man next to him was untouched. A sniper would fire, hitting one Marine in a group while others survived. There was no logic, no fairness, no justice. Survival was luck. October 1944, the end of Peleliu. By October, the 1st Marine Division was being systematically destroyed. Casualties exceeded 60%, over 6,000 Marines killed or wounded. Many units existed in name only, with 20 to 30 men representing companies that should have 200. In mid-October, the 81st Infantry Division relieved the Marines. K/3/5 was pulled off the line and evacuated to Pavuvu in the Russell Islands to rest and refit. Sledge left Peleliu on October 15, 1944, exactly 1 month after landing. He had aged years in that month. The slight young man from Mobile had become a hardened combat veteran. He had killed Japanese soldiers, he didn't know how many, and didn't want to count. He had watched friends die. He had experienced fear beyond anything he'd imagined possible. And he had survived. The official statistics: Peleliu cost the 1st Marine Division 1,252 dead and 5,274 wounded. K/3/5's casualties were proportionally similar. The company was essentially destroyed and had to be rebuilt with replacements. The strategic value of Peleliu was questionable. The island's airfield, which was the objective, could have been bypassed. General Douglas MacArthur's Philippines campaign didn't actually need Peleliu. The battle was arguably unnecessary. Marines died for an island that didn't matter. This realization came later. In October 1944, Sledge and the survivors were simply relieved to be alive. Pavuvu, between battles. Pavuvu was supposed to be a rest area. It was miserable. The Russell Islands were a coconut plantation that the military had converted to a base. The conditions were terrible. Mud everywhere, coconut palms providing minimal shade, rats the size of small cats, land crabs that would enter tents at night, poor food, limited recreation. But it wasn't combat. That made it paradise by comparison. Sledge and the surviving veterans of K/3/5 spent weeks doing nothing. Sleeping, eating, writing letters home, playing cards, swimming in the ocean. They were recovering physically and psychologically from Peleliu. Replacements arrived to fill the ranks. Sledge and other veterans watched these new Marines with a mixture of pity and annoyance. The replacements didn't understand what combat was like. They thought they were ready. The veterans knew better. Training resumed. The replacements needed to learn infantry tactics. The veterans needed to regain sharpness that had dulled during rest. The company ran drills, practiced amphibious landings, conducted live-fire exercises. In December 1944, K/3/5 received word. Another operation was coming. The target was Okinawa, a Japanese home island in the Ryukyu chain, just 350 miles from mainland Japan. Intelligence predicted heavy resistance. Sledge's reaction, which he recorded later, was resignation. He had survived Peleliu through luck. He didn't expect to survive Okinawa. The odds were against him. 2 major amphibious assaults, each one statistically likely to kill or wound participants. He made his peace with death and prepared to go back. Part 2. Okinawa, April 1st, 1945. April 1st, 1945. L-Day. Love Day, the designation for Okinawa's D-Day. Sledge climbed down cargo nets into an Amtrak for the second time in his combat career. Around him were the veterans of Peleliu, Bergen, Snafu, Leyden, others. They knew what was coming. The landing was expected to be catastrophic. Okinawa was Japan's doorstep. The Japanese would defend it fanatically. Intelligence estimated tens of thousands of defenders. The landing beaches would be killing zones. The Amtraks churned toward the beaches. Sledge waited for the explosions, the machine gun fire, the chaos of opposed landing. Nothing happened. The Amtraks landed unopposed. Marines ran up the beaches expecting fire. Nothing. They advanced inland. Still nothing. The Japanese had ceded the beaches entirely. By nightfall on L-Day, 2 Marine divisions and 2 Army divisions had landed approximately 60,000 troops with minimal casualties. It was the easiest major amphibious landing of the Pacific War. Sledge and the K/3/5 veterans didn't trust it. The Japanese were somewhere, waiting. The absence of resistance on the beaches meant the killing would happen elsewhere. They were correct. The nature of Okinawa. Okinawa was different from Peleliu in scale. Peleliu was 6 square miles. Okinawa was 463 square miles, over 70 times larger. The campaign would last not weeks, but months. The Japanese strategy, designed by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, was defense in depth. Rather than contesting the beaches, Japanese forces had fortified the southern portion of Okinawa, creating a defensive line anchored on ancient Okinawan fortifications. The Shuri Line, named after Shuri Castle, was a series of ridges, valleys, and fortified positions that took advantage of the terrain. The American plan was to land, secure the central portion of Okinawa, including airfields, then push south against the Japanese defensive line, while simultaneously pushing north to clear that portion of the island. K/3/5 participated in the initial advance south. For the first week, resistance was light. Skirmishes, sniper fire, but no major engagements. This created false hope among replacements that Okinawa might be easy. On April 8th, the Marines hit the Shuri Line. The easy war ended. The Shuri Line, April-May 1945. The fighting along the Shuri Line was methodical attrition. Japanese forces occupied fortified positions on ridges with names like Half Moon Hill, Horseshoe Ridge, and Wana Ridge. Each position had to be taken through frontal assault. The tactics were grim. Artillery would bombard Japanese positions. Then infantry would advance, often into pre-registered defensive fire from Japanese artillery and mortars. Marines would assault the positions, take casualties, maybe secure the position, then face counterattack at night when Japanese forces would attempt to retake lost ground. The casualty rate was steady and terrible. K/3/5 took casualties daily. Not the catastrophic casualties of Peleliu's worst days, but a grinding attrition that depleted the company. Each day, 2 or 3 men would be killed or wounded. Each week, 10 to 15 more casualties. The company was bleeding to death slowly. Sledge's mortar squad operated continuously. They would establish firing positions behind the front line, receive fire missions from forward observers, and launch high explosive rounds at Japanese positions. The work was physically exhausting. Each mortar round weighed several pounds, and the squad might fire dozens per day. The conditions were worse than Peleliu. Okinawa in spring had heavy rains, the ground turned to mud, foxholes filled with water, Marines lived in cold, wet misery. Trench foot became endemic. Feet that stayed wet too long would rot, becoming infected and eventually gangrenous if not treated. The terrain was agricultural. Rice paddies, villages, irrigation ditches. All of it became contaminated. Bodies lay in the open, decomposing in the heat and rain. The stench was overwhelming. Water sources were contaminated with decomposition products. Everything smelled of death. The descent into savagery. Sledge witnessed and participated in the complete breakdown of civilized behavior. Japanese soldiers defended positions to the death. Very few surrendered. The concept of honorable surrender didn't exist in Japanese military culture. Surrender was disgrace, worse than death. This meant every position had to be cleared by killing every defender. The close-quarters nature of the fighting meant violence was personal. Marines used grenades, rifles, bayonets, knives, even entrenching tools as weapons. Sledge saw men killed in hand-to-hand combat, skulls crushed by rifle butts, throats cut with knives. This was warfare stripped of any honor or glory. It was butchery. The Marines responded with increasing brutality. Wounded Japanese soldiers were shot rather than captured. They might be feigning to get close enough to detonate a grenade. Civilians caught in the fighting were viewed with suspicion. Japanese soldiers sometimes disguised themselves as civilians. The default response to any uncertainty was violence. Sledge recorded incidents that disturbed him even as he became inured to violence. A Marine prying gold teeth from a wounded Japanese soldier who was still alive. The Japanese soldier groaning as the Marine worked, finally dying. Marines urinating on Japanese corpses or defecating near bodies as insults. The casual way Marines would discuss killing, as if discussing farming or sports rather than ending human lives. A Marine who collected ears from Japanese dead, keeping them in a bag, eventually having to throw them away when they began to rot. Sledge himself engaged in behaviors he would have found reprehensible months earlier. He felt no guilt when his mortar fire killed Japanese soldiers. He felt satisfaction when direct hits on enemy positions eliminated threats to his squad. The morality that had been part of his upbringing in Mobile, Christian ethics, respect for life, eroded completely. He recognized this transformation and was disturbed by it, but he also accepted it as necessary for survival. To survive, you had to stop seeing the enemy as human. You had to become capable of killing without hesitation or regret. The alternative was psychological breakdown. The rain and the mud. In early May, the rainy season intensified. Okinawa turned into a swamp. Operations continued despite the mud. Sledge described living conditions. Foxholes would fill with water overnight. Marines would wake up essentially in bathtubs of muddy water. There was no dry ground. Equipment became coated in mud. Weapons required constant cleaning to prevent malfunction. The battlefield itself became a nightmare of mud and bodies. Tanks bogged down. Supply vehicles couldn't reach forward positions. Wounded men had to be carried through knee-deep mud for evacuation. And everywhere, bodies. American dead were evacuated when possible, but Japanese dead lay where they fell. In the heat and rain, decomposition was rapid. Bodies bloated, turned black, leaked fluids into the mud. The smell was so pervasive that Marines could not escape it. It permeated clothing, hair, skin. Sledge recorded that decades later, certain smells would trigger visceral memories of Okinawa. The smell of decay, of mud, of death. These became permanently associated with the battle in his mind. The Half Moon, May 1945. In mid-May, K/3/5 was tasked with taking a position called Half Moon Hill. a crescent-shaped ridge that was part of the Shuri Line defenses. The operation exemplified Okinawa's grinding nature. The Marines attacked Half Moon on May 14th. The initial assault made some progress. Marines reached the crest of the ridge and dug in. But Japanese counterattacks that night drove them back. The next day, Marines attacked again. Again, they reached the crest. Again, counterattacks forced them back. This pattern repeated for days. Attack, take casualties, secure position, face counterattack, lose position, attack again. Sledge's mortar squad fired hundreds of rounds in support of these attacks. The 60mm mortar's high explosive rounds would impact Japanese positions, killing or suppressing defenders temporarily. But the Japanese defensive positions were well constructed. Many defenders survived in bunkers and caves, emerging after bombardment to contest Marine advances. The casualty rate during the Half Moon fighting was appalling. K/3/5 lost dozens of men, killed and wounded in less than a week. By May 20th, when the position was finally secured, the company had been reduced to roughly half strength. Sledge survived through luck. Mortar positions were targeted by Japanese counter-battery fire, but the Japanese fire was inaccurate enough that Sledge's position was never hit directly. Several times, rounds landed close enough to shower the mortar squad with mud and shrapnel, but no one was killed. The randomness continued to haunt him. One mortar crew member would be killed by a shell, while Sledge, standing 10 feet away, would be untouched. There was no logic to survival, only probability and chance. Sugar Loaf Hill. While K/3/5 fought at Half Moon, other Marine units were engaged in one of the bloodiest battles of Okinawa, Sugarloaf Hill. Sugarloaf was a 50-foot coral hill that anchored Japanese defenses around Shuri. The 6th Marine Division was tasked with taking it. The battle for Sugarloaf lasted from May 12th to 18th and cost the Marines over 2,000 casualties. The 6th Marines would attack, sometimes taking the crest, only to be driven off by counterattacks. 11 times, Marines took Sugarloaf's crest. 11 times, they were forced to withdraw. Finally, on May 18th, the position was secured. Sledge and K/3/5 were close enough to see the fighting and hear the combat. They witnessed the Marine casualties being evacuated. Hundreds of wounded men, dozens of dead. The message was clear. Okinawa was devouring the Marine divisions. June 1945, the end of the Shuri Line. By late May, the Shuri Line began to collapse. Constant American attacks, heavy casualties, and the realization that the position was no longer tenable led Japanese commanders to order a withdrawal to defensive positions in southern Okinawa. American forces pursued, but the Japanese withdrawal was orderly. They fell back to new defensive lines and continued fighting. K/3/5 pursued as part of the general advance. The pursuit was costly. Japanese rearguard actions inflicted steady casualties. But the character of the fighting changed. Rather than assaulting fortified positions on ridges, Marines were now conducting mobile warfare, advancing through southern Okinawa's agricultural lands. The civilian population complicated operations. Thousands of Okinawan civilians had been caught in the fighting. Some had been conscripted by Japanese forces. Others were simply trying to survive. Marines encountered civilians regularly, sometimes as refugees seeking safety, sometimes as victims caught in crossfire, sometimes as threats. Japanese soldiers occasionally forced civilians to approach American positions carrying concealed grenades. The treatment of civilians was inconsistent. Some Marines showed compassion, providing food and medical care. Others viewed all Okinawans as potential threats. The combat environment made distinguishing combatants from civilians nearly impossible. Sledge recorded an incident where K/3/5 encountered a group of Okinawan civilians, women, children, elderly. The Marines provided water and rations and directed them to the rear. But that same day, the company took fire from a position near where civilians had been seen. The suspicion and paranoia were constant. The final offensive. June 1945. By mid-June, Japanese forces had been pushed to the southern tip of Okinawa. The end was inevitable. They were out of room to retreat, supplies were dwindling, reinforcement was impossible. But they continued fighting. The final offensive against the last Japanese positions began June 11th. K/3/5 participated in what would be the last major combat operation of the Okinawa campaign. The fighting maintained its brutal character. Japanese forces, knowing they were defeated, fought with fatalistic determination. They inflicted casualties until they were killed. Surrender remained rare. On June 21st, 1945, organized Japanese resistance ended. Lieutenant General Ushijima and his chief of staff committed ritual suicide rather than surrender. Scattered Japanese soldiers continued fighting. Some would hold out for weeks in caves, but the battle was effectively over. K/3/5 was pulled off the line on June 21st. The company had been in continuous combat for 82 days. The casualty rate was staggering. The company had been rebuilt multiple times with replacements, and even the replacements had taken heavy casualties. Sledge had survived, again. Against probability, against logic, against the odds. He was alive. The cost. The statistics for Okinawa are almost incomprehensible. American casualties. Approximately 12,000 killed, 38,000 wounded, 33,000 non-battle casualties. Disease, injury, psychological breakdown. Total. Over 83,000 casualties out of approximately 180,000 personnel engaged. Japanese military casualties. Approximately 77,000 killed, less than 10,000 captured. Okinawan civilian deaths. Estimated 40,000 to 150,000. Estimates vary widely. The 1st Marine Division casualties. Approximately 1,150 killed, 5,000 wounded. K/3/5's casualties. The company started with approximately 200 to 235 men. By the end of Okinawa, the company had suffered over 150 casualties. Killed, wounded, or psychological breakdown. Some men had been wounded, evacuated, recovered, and returned to the unit only to be wounded again. Sledge lost friends, squad mates, men he had trained with. Some were killed instantly, others died slowly from wounds. Some were evacuated with physical wounds but would never recover psychologically. And Sledge himself had survived 2 of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Peleliu and Okinawa combined cost the 1st Marine Division over 12,000 casualties. Sledge had been present for both and emerged physically intact, but he was not intact. The young man from Mobile who had enlisted in 1943 no longer existed. That person had been destroyed in the coral ridges of Peleliu and the muddy hills of Okinawa. August 1945. The war ends. After Okinawa, K/3/5 was withdrawn to a rear area to rest and prepare for the next operation. Intelligence indicated the next target would be the Japanese home islands. Kyushu first, then Honshu. Casualty estimates for the invasion of Japan were catastrophic. Some projections suggested 1 million American casualties. Sledge and the veterans expected to die in Japan. They had survived 2 battles through luck. A 3rd battle against defending their homeland seemed certain to kill them. But on August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, a 2nd bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. Sledge's reaction, recorded in his memoir, was relief beyond description. He would not have to invade Japan. He would not have to face another Peleliu or Okinawa. He might actually survive and go home. K/3/5 was assigned occupation duty in China, helping disarm Japanese forces and maintain order during the transition. Sledge spent several months in China before finally receiving orders to return to the United States. On January 30th, 1946, Eugene Sledge boarded a ship for home. He had been overseas for nearly 2 years. He had fought in 2 major battles. He had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But he was alive. He was going home. Epilogue. The aftermath. Eugene Sledge returned to Mobile, Alabama in early 1946. The homecoming was difficult. His family was overjoyed to see him alive, but they quickly realized he had changed. The young man who had left in 1943 had been replaced by someone harder, quieter, more distant. Sledge had nightmares. Loud noises made him flinch. He couldn't talk about the war, the words wouldn't come, and the memories were too painful. Sledge struggled to adjust to civilian life. The pace of civilian existence seemed trivial after combat. People worried about jobs, money, relationships, things that seemed meaningless to someone who had watched friends die for coral ridges and muddy hills. He enrolled at Auburn University in 1946, studying biology. The structure of academic life helped. The focus on science, particularly ornithology, the study of birds, provided an outlet. Birds didn't trigger war memories. Studying them was peaceful. But the nightmares continued. The memories remained vivid. Sledge would wake up sweating, remembering Peleliu's heat or Okinawa's mud. He would smell something, decay, rain on Earth, even certain foods, and be transported back to the Pacific. The psychological wounds were as real as any physical injury, though they were invisible. Sledge met and married Jean Arsenault in 1952. She became his anchor, someone who accepted his silences, his nightmares, his need for solitude. She never pressed him to talk about the war, understanding instinctively that the memories were too painful. He completed his bachelor's degree at Auburn, then went on to earn a doctorate in biology from the University of Florida in 1960. His dissertation was on birds. The academic career that followed, teaching biology at Alabama College, later University of Montevallo, gave him purpose and stability. For decades, Sledge told almost no one about Peleliu or Okinawa. His children grew up knowing their father had been a Marine in World War II, but not knowing the specifics. His colleagues at the university knew he was a veteran, but not what he had experienced. The decision to write. In the late 1950s, Sledge made a decision that would ultimately preserve one of the most important accounts of ground combat in the Pacific War. He began writing about his experiences. The decision came from multiple sources. He had kept notes during the war, small scraps of paper, pocket-sized New Testament with observations written in margins, details jotted down when he could. These notes had survived, tucked away in his possessions. Additionally, the memories were not fading. Decades after the war, Sledge could still remember details with painful clarity. The faces of men who had died, the specific contours of terrain on Peleliu, the smell of Okinawa's mud, the sound of incoming mortars. The memories were permanent, and writing became a way to process them. Finally, Sledge recognized that the combat experience of enlisted Marines, the perspective from the bottom of the military hierarchy, was rarely recorded. Generals wrote memoirs, officers published accounts, but the view from a foxhole, from a private or PFC, was largely absent from historical records. Sledge began writing in longhand, working slowly and carefully. He would write passages, then set them aside for weeks or months before returning. The process was emotionally exhausting. Reliving the experiences triggered nightmares and anxiety, but he continued. The manuscript took years to complete. Sledge wrote primarily for himself and his family. He had no expectation of publication. The goal was to record what had happened before the memories were lost or distorted by time. The book, With the Old Breed. In 1981, nearly 35 years after returning from the Pacific, Eugene Sledge's manuscript was published by Presidio Press under the title With the Old Breed, at Peleliu and Okinawa. The book made little initial impact. It received positive reviews in military history publications, but was not a bestseller. It found an audience among veterans and military historians who recognized its authenticity and detail. What distinguished With the Old Breed from other World War II memoirs was its unflinching honesty. Sledge did not romanticize war. He did not present combat as heroic or glorious. He described it accurately. Terrifying, brutal, dehumanizing, and often pointless. He wrote about the fear, the constant gnawing fear that accompanied every patrol, every attack, every moment in combat. He described the physical degradation. Men who lost 30 to 40 pounds from dysentery and malnutrition, who developed infections and diseases, who aged years in months. He documented the psychological transformation, how men who entered combat as civilized human beings were reduced to creatures focused solely on survival, how morality became situational, how killing became routine. And he recorded the small details that brought the experience to life. The taste of warm, chemical-laced water, the texture of coral cutting through uniforms, the weight of equipment after hours of carrying it, the particular sound of different types of artillery, the way fear smelled, sweat mixed with cordite and decomposition. Military historians immediately recognized the book's value. It provided the enlisted perspective that was so often missing. It described infantry combat with a level of detail and accuracy that few accounts matched. Professor John Keegan, the renowned British military historian, called it one of the finest memoirs to emerge from any war. Rediscovery and recognition. With the Old Breed, found a larger audience in subsequent decades. It was used in military academies and war colleges as a teaching text. The Marine Corps included it in professional reading lists. Academic historians studying the Pacific War cited it extensively. In 2001, historian Stephen Ambrose featured Sledge's story in his book Citizen Soldiers and advocated strongly for With the Old Breed, calling it essential reading for understanding ground combat. But the book's greatest exposure came in 2010 with the HBO miniseries The Pacific, produced by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg. The series was based partly on With the Old Breed and depicted Sledge's experiences at Peleliu and Okinawa. Actor Joseph Mazzello portrayed Sledge. The miniseries brought With the Old Breed to mainstream attention. The book became a bestseller 3 decades after its original publication. New readers discovered Sledge's account and were confronted with the reality of war, stripped of Hollywood glamorization. Sledge himself lived to see some of this recognition. He gave occasional interviews, spoke at Marine Corps events, and corresponded with readers. But he remained humble about his service and his book. He insisted that he had simply done his duty, as had thousands of other Marines, and that his experiences were representative rather than exceptional. The lessons of Sledge's war. What makes Eugene Sledge's account so important is not just its historical accuracy, but its honesty about war's human cost. Sledge documented the physical cost: men killed, wounded, maimed. Bodies that survived but were permanently damaged by wounds, disease, or malnutrition. The 12,000 plus casualties the 1st Marine Division suffered in 2 battles. He documented the psychological cost: combat trauma that lasted decades, nightmares that never fully ceased, hypervigilance that made civilian life difficult, emotional numbness that made relationships challenging. The way combat veterans were forever separated from non-veterans by experiences that couldn't be explained or understood. He documented the moral cost: the brutalization of civilized men, the descent into savagery, the dehumanization of the enemy that made killing possible, the guilt that came later when reflecting on actions that seemed necessary during combat but seemed monstrous in retrospect. He documented the ultimate futility: Peleliu, where Marines died for an island that contributed little to victory. Okinawa, where 12,000 Americans and over 100,000 Japanese and Okinawans died for an island that would be handed back to Japan decades later. The question that haunted veterans: what was it for? Sledge's answer, implicit throughout With the Old Breed, was that war was for the men beside you. Not for grand strategy or political objectives, but for your squad mates, your company, your fellow Marines. You fought to keep them alive, and they fought to keep you alive. The only meaning that could be extracted from the horror was brotherhood under fire, the impact on military understanding. With the Old Breed changed how military professionals understood ground combat. Several aspects of Sledge's account influenced military training and doctrine. the psychological dimension. Sledge's detailed description of combat stress, psychological breakdown, and the accumulation of trauma influenced how the military addressed combat stress. His account made clear that every soldier has a breaking point, that courage is finite, and that psychological casualties are as real as physical wounds. The reality of small unit. Combat. Sledge's ground-level view showed that grand strategy was irrelevant to the infantryman. What mattered was the immediate tactical situation. The machine gun position ahead, the mortar fire coming in, the cover available. His account reinforced the importance of small unit leadership and cohesion. The importance of training. Sledge survived partly because of effective training. The repetitive drills, the emphasis on basic infantry skills, the creation of automatic responses, these proved crucial when conscious thought became impossible under stress. His account validated training methodologies that emphasize repetition until skills become instinctive. The human limits of combat effectiveness. Sledge documented that units have limited combat effectiveness over time. K/3/5 was essentially destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Men reached their limits, physical and psychological, and could no longer function. His account supported policies of rotating units out of combat before they became completely combat ineffective. Sledge's later years. Eugene Sledge continued teaching at the University of Montevallo until his retirement in 1990. He maintained contact with surviving members of K/3/5, attending reunions when health permitted. The bonds forged in combat never weakened. Men who had fought together at Peleliu and Okinawa remained close for the rest of their lives. In his later years, Sledge became more willing to discuss his experiences. He gave interviews to military historians. He corresponded with readers of his book. He spoke at military events. But he never glorified war or his role in it. His message was consistent. War is horror, necessary sometimes, but always terrible, and those who fight pay a price that never fully heals. Sledge was diagnosed with stomach cancer in the early 2000s. The disease progressed despite treatment. He died on March 3, 2001, at his home in Montevallo, Alabama. He was 77 years old. His funeral was attended by family, colleagues from the university, and surviving members of K/3/5. He was buried in a small cemetery in Montevallo. His gravestone is simple, noting his service in the Marine Corps and his career as an educator. The obituaries noted his service at Peleliu and Okinawa, and his authorship of With the Old Breed. But they also noted his life after the war. His marriage of nearly 50 years. His career teaching biology, his love of nature and birds, his quiet dignity. Eugene Sledge was more than a combat veteran. He was a man who survived horror and built a meaningful life despite the psychological scars. The legacy. Eugene Sledge's legacy is multifaceted. As a combat Marine, he was part of the 1st Marine Division that fought 2 of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific War. As a writer, he produced one of the finest first-hand accounts of ground combat ever written. As an educator, he taught biology to thousands of students over 3 decades. As a man, he demonstrated that even profound trauma can be survived, and a meaningful life constructed despite psychological wounds. With the Old Breed remains in print and continues to find new readers. It is taught in military schools, used in academic courses on World War II, and read by those seeking to understand the reality of combat. The book's power comes from Sledge's refusal to sentimentalize or romanticize. He tells the truth about war as he experienced it. For the Marine Corps, Sledge's account has become an essential text. It provides the enlisted perspective on 2 battles central to Marine Corps history. It validates the Corps' emphasis on training, unit cohesion, and small unit leadership. And it serves as a reminder of the human cost of war, a cost paid by young men like Sledge who answered their nation's call. For historians, With the Old Breed is a primary source of exceptional value. Sledge's detailed observations, his notes taken during combat, and his careful post-war writing created a document that illuminates aspects of Pacific War combat that official histories often miss. His account complements the strategic histories by showing what war looked like from a foxhole on Okinawa. For general readers, the book is an education in war's reality. It strips away the myths propagated by movies and popular culture. It shows that war is not glorious adventure, but a grinding, terrifying experience that destroys men physically and psychologically. And it demonstrates that those who survive carry the burden of those experiences for the rest of their lives. Final reflections. Eugene Sledge was 20 years old when he landed on Peleliu. He was 21 when Okinawa ended. Those two battles, occupying less than 6 months of his life, defined him forever. He lived another 55 years after returning from the Pacific. He married, raised children, earned a doctorate, taught for 3 decades, published a book, and lived what by most measures was a successful and meaningful life. But Peleliu and Okinawa never left him. The nightmares continued into old age. The memories remained vivid. The psychological wounds stayed open. In his final interview before his death, Sledge said, "I survived the war, but part of me died in the Pacific and never came home." This is the reality that, with the old breed documents, war destroys people. Some are destroyed physically, killed or wounded. Others are destroyed psychologically. They survive, but carry trauma that never heals. And even those who seem to recover, who build lives and careers and families, carry wounds that remain invisible but permanent. Sledge's willingness to document this reality honestly, without embellishment or romanticization, is what makes his account so valuable and so painful to read. He tells the truth. War is hell, and those who experience it are never the same. The college kid from Mobile who loved bird hunting and literature went to war believing in duty and honor. He came home understanding that war destroys honor, that survival is luck, and that the cost of combat is measured not just in bodies, but in souls. Eugene Sledge's war ended in August 1945 when Japan surrendered. But Eugene Sledge's battle with the psychological wounds of war continued until March 3, 2001, when he finally found peace in death. He survived Peleliu and Okinawa against all odds. He survived the psychological aftermath for 55 years. He recorded his experiences so that others might understand what war truly costs. With the old breed is his memorial to the Marines who didn't come home, the men killed on Peleliu's coral ridges and Okinawa's muddy hills. It is also his testimony to the cost paid by those who did come home but were forever changed by what they experienced. In the final passage of his book, Sledge reflected on what the war had taught him. Until the millennium arrives and countries cease trying to enslave others, it will be necessary to accept one's responsibilities and be willing to make sacrifices for one's country, as my comrades did. As the troops used to say, if the country is good enough to live in, it's good enough to fight for. With privilege goes responsibility. Eugene Bondurant Sledge, U.S. Marine Corps, 1943 to 1946. He fought at Peleliu and Okinawa. He survived. He bore witness. He told the truth. We remember him, and through him, we remember all those who fought in the Pacific, those who came home and those who didn't, those who survived physically but not psychologically, those who carried the burden of war for the rest of their lives. This is Eugene Sledge's story. It is one man's war, but it represents the experience of thousands. It is specific in its details, but universal in its truths about combat, fear, survival, and the permanent cost of war. May we never forget.